You find yourself on frigid stone, enveloped in complete darkness, situated below the most immense arena of death ever built. Above, 60,000 Romans have just roared themselves voiceless, witnessing your husband's life drain onto the sand. As they depart for their evening meals, their baths, and their slumber, you can still detect his scent, iron and perspiration permeating through the grates. One by one, the torches extinguish. Gates groan as they close somewhere within the labyrinthine passages surrounding you. Then, a sound reaches your ears. Footsteps. Slow, measured steps draw nearer. A silhouette fills the archway. Keys jingle, the lock yields, and there, before you, stands the very man who moments ago plunged a sword into your husband's chest. This is not a fictional tale. It's not an embellished account. This was merely a typical Tuesday in ancient Rome. More than just an arena, the Colosseum presented a gleaming facade for a much more sinister reality. A vast, subterranean human trafficking operation that continued its grim work long after spectators had departed. Underneath the marble seating, beneath the blood-drenched floor of the arena, Rome maintained a clandestine empire of human bodies, a bureaucratic apparatus that meticulously categorized individuals as if they were mere cattle. Historians have coined a specific term for one aspect of this: Victoria Carnalis, since the Romans themselves saw no need to name what they regarded as entirely commonplace. We are now poised to delve into that netherworld, where you will discover how enslaved women were reduced to mere entries in an accounting book. You'll also learn how victorious combatants claimed their rewards, and how the very empire renowned for constructing roads and aqueducts simultaneously refined systematic terror. Within the subterranean passages beneath the roaring crowds, by the time we re-emerge, every preconception you held about gladiators, about Rome, and about civilization itself will be utterly demolished. However, before we venture into those passageways, please leave a comment indicating your viewing location. To grasp the ordeal that woman was on the verge of experiencing, one must first comprehend Rome's own perception of triumph. When Roman legions quelled an uprising, they didn't merely seize land, they harvested human beings with the identical ruthless efficiency applied to acquiring gold or timber. A subjugated city was not viewed as a calamity, but rather as a shipment. Soldiers categorized the survivors like freight, separating them into groups based on one crucial inquiry: what can be extracted from this individual? Men capable of wielding a sword were presented with two equally harsh options. Some were dispatched to quarries and mines, toiling until their demise. Others were consigned to the arena, pitted against wild animals or trained to become gladiators. Children, meanwhile, disappeared into slave markets spanning from Hispania all the way to Syria. The women, in turn, were given their own designation: captiva, spoils of war, property of the state. From that instant, their destinies were determined not by their personal desires, but by written decrees on parchment. Roman law ensured the seamless operation of this system. According to their legal framework, a vanquished foe who had been enslaved no longer held the status of a complete human being. Enslaved individuals were classified identically to tools and animals. The Latin term for this was res, meaning things or objects. Just as a table possessed no rights, neither did an enslaved woman. If her owner subjected her to starvation, brutality, or violation, it was not considered a crime in any way we would comprehend today. Ultimately, it amounted to mere property damage, a monetary nuisance for the proprietor. The victim's pain, though, held no legal recognition. Yet legal frameworks alone were insufficient to maintain an empire's cohesion. Rome required grand displays. The games served not as mere amusement, but as instruction. Observing a captive torn asunder by savage beasts from the arena seats imparted a profound lesson. This lesson demonstrated the fate awaiting any who challenged Roman authority. Fear made manifest, presented alongside musical accompaniment, food sellers, and roaring ovations. Such was a standard day at a prominent amphitheater. The daily program adhered to a predictable routine. Mornings featured animal hunts and clashes with exotic creatures, while midday was set aside for capital punishments. The afternoon then showcased the main event. The gladiator matches, particularly during the midday period when affluent Romans commonly departed for meals or political discussions, often presented the most morally corrupt spectacles. This specific time slot was dedicated to what contemporary historians term fatal charades, dramatic presentations drawing from well-known myths and legends, with the crucial distinction that no performers would return for applause. Subsequently, condemned individuals were dressed as iconic characters from tales familiar to every Roman. Their demise was transformed into a public spectacle. Spectators were presented with a well-known storyline, but with a vital distinction. The bloodshed was authentic. The poet Martial, active in the 1st century AD, documented these events with disturbing nonchalance. He wasn't revealing horrors, rather, he was critiquing entertainment. In one particular excerpt, he details a man compelled to portray Orpheus. This legendary musician, whose music possessed the power to soothe any beast, saw the captive enter the arena, holding a lyre. He was never afforded the opportunity to pluck even one string. A bear was unleashed, dismembering him as onlookers consumed refreshments and clamored for additional action. Martial remarked that on this occasion, the enchantment eluded him, a rather astute comment. For the captive, it marked his ultimate instant of life. Another scene recorded by Martial is considerably more gruesome. It's centered on the myth of Pasiphae, a queen who, as per tradition, mated with a sacred bull. The Romans adapted this tale into a public demonstration. A condemned female was readied, guided into the amphitheater, and placed strategically. This arrangement allowed an animal to be forced upon her. There were no deceptions or stand-ins. The crowd witnessed an actual person being attacked by a genuine creature. She succumbed to her wounds before the entire assembly, which was precisely the intended outcome. This was neither an unforeseen incident nor a technical fault. It had been publicly announced beforehand. This particular aspect holds significance. The Roman government did not hide this brutality. Instead, it actively publicized it. Painted notices on urban walls foretold the types of atrocities attendees should anticipate. Senators, traders, nobles, and their relatives came fully aware they would observe individuals being incinerated, dismembered, disgraced, and symbolically annihilated. Some even brought their offspring. Vendors moved among the seating areas, offering snacks, while the condemned screamed. This was not the act of a single mad emperor losing his sanity. Rather, it constituted official policy, persisting for many generations under various leaders. The state financed it, functionaries organized it, and authors such as Martial and Juvenal documented it without any indication of surprise. This method allowed the empire to accustom its populace to perceive subjugated peoples as less than human, especially after witnessing a man costumed as Orpheus. If dying for entertainment was acceptable, then a woman held captive under the same venue was readily seen as merely another trophy. She was considered just another item, given out as a reward for success. Now let's refocus on gladiators. These individuals live with a peculiar paradox. By law, the majority were enslaved. Some were offenders condemned to the contests, while others were wartime captives. A small number chose to participate, seeking wealth or renown. Regardless of their background, upon entering the training academies, they became possessions. Their physical selves were owned by another. This owner was typically a rich manager known as a lanista, or, at the highest echelons, the emperor himself. Nevertheless, gladiators attained a level of celebrity that free citizens could only dream of. Their likenesses were depicted in mosaics in street art. Admirers carved their names onto walls in places such as Pompeii, with hastily written messages honoring particular combatants. One was dubbed the girl's heartthrob, another the women's pride. Young men emulated their mannerisms, and children engaged in games where they pretended to be them. Women from prominent families found them particularly enthralling. Ancient authors, with a hint of cynicism, recounted tales of aristocratic women bribing guards to gain clandestine entry into gladiator quarters. After nightfall, tales spread concerning combatants such as Sergius, a battle-scarred fighter who secretly became the paramour of several married noblewomen, igniting scandals that permeated every social gathering. Even the perspiration of gladiators became a valuable item. Following contests, assistants would collect the oil, dirt, and sweat from their bodies. This concoction was then bottled and marketed as a cosmetic and an aphrodisiac, bought by affluent women. They held the belief that a vestige of the gladiator's strength and allure would be imparted to them. Thus, Rome had inadvertently created a perilous situation. This involved a populace of skilled assassins who shared deep familiarity, resided in confined spaces, and were revered by certain parts of society. Furthermore, they harbored intense resentment. A significant number had been seized, enslaved, or sentenced by the very government that now exhibited them for entertainment. The threat was not merely theoretical. In 73 BC, approximately 70 gladiators escaped from a training facility in Capua, led by an individual known to history as Spartacus. They equipped themselves with weapons and absconded. What began as an escape from confinement escalated into a full-blown conflict, with thousands of runaway slaves and impoverished farmers joining their ranks. At its zenith, the insurgent army might have comprised 70,000 combatants. They consistently vanquished Roman legions for almost 2 years. Rome proved unable to halt their advance. Once the uprising was ultimately suppressed, the retribution was intended to resonate for ages. Around 6,000 captured insurgents were crucified along the Appian Way, the primary road leading into Rome. The crucifixes extended for several miles. Historical accounts suggest a corpse appeared every few dozen steps, turning the thoroughfare into a protracted passage of public execution. That vivid scene imprinted itself deeply upon the Roman collective consciousness for many generations, serving as both a cautionary tale and a lasting trauma. From that point onward, every armed gladiator seemed like a potential Spartacus. Rome could not afford negligence, yet it also couldn't simply set them free. Consequently, the empire offered inducements: superior food, enhanced living arrangements, monetary rewards following victorious battles, and occasionally even the pledge of a rudous wooden sword. This symbolized a gladiator's attainment of full liberty after enduring a sufficient number of contests. Furthermore, another element, seldom explicitly mentioned but woven into the system, existed. This involved access to enslaved women. The documentary proof for this isn't detailed in any single handbook. Roman writers seldom elucidate the specifics comprehensively. However, when piecing together excerpts from Martial and Juvenal, along with later analyses in legal documents, a consistent pattern becomes apparent. Following significant games, particularly those funded by emperors or power-hungry politicians keen to impress the populace, triumphant gladiators reportedly obtained the privileges of the victor. This expression is intentionally ambiguous, and contemporary historians surmise that among these entitlements was the prerogative to utilize women confined below the arena. From the viewpoint of the state, this simultaneously resolved several issues. It compensated the combatants without bestowing genuine authority or autonomy upon them. It incurred virtually no expense, as the prisoners were already present, having already been categorized as war spoils. Moreover, it underscored Rome's fundamental doctrine regarding subjugation. Victory grants you control over individuals, grants you entry, and grants you the authority to act as you please, with those officially reduced to mere objects. Now, let's revisit that solitary woman in a dim chamber beneath the arena. She had already passed through Rome's administrative system. Troops had forcibly removed her from her residence months, or perhaps even years prior. An administrator had inscribed her name, or a close variant, into an account book. Her place of origin was recorded: from Gaul, from Britannia, from Judea, or from some tribal group whose name the Romans found too troublesome to accurately transcribe. She was enumerated, categorized, and conveyed alongside other prisoners. She constituted a component of a consignment. Certain women from that particular delivery found themselves in private residences, serving as domestics or concubines. Others were sold at public auctions in urban plazas, Yet a particular segment was dispatched to venues, such as the Colosseum. Their purpose was not to appear in the sunlight before enthusiastic spectators, but rather to await their fate in subterranean stone chambers, designated as state assets. Joined to the games, they received shelter and sustenance merely sufficient to sustain life, and were maintained in a state of readiness for deployment whenever authorities deemed it appropriate. On the day her husband perished, she might have been allowed a last glimpse of him, or perhaps she overheard his cries without identifying his specific voice. Regardless, after his corpse was removed and the arena's sand was smoothed for the subsequent contest, her destiny remained undetermined. Legally, she was not considered an individual under Roman jurisdiction, but rather a commodity administered by the arena's officialdom. Therefore, when those approaching footsteps halted outside her cell and the key rotated in the lock, it was not by chance. Somewhere, a scribe had inscribed a notation onto a wax tablet, a gladiator's designation, and a symbol next to a numeral signifying a captive. A pairing had been arranged. The individual standing in the entrance had just delivered to Rome precisely what it desired on the arena floor above. What Rome deemed his due was being meted out. Above, the throngs were scattering, and the stadium's torches flickered out. Yet deep below the arena, the night was just commencing. The gladiator pivoted towards the steps, plunging further into the subterranean passages, heading for the chambers prepared for the subsequent stage of events. We shall accompany him into that subterranean complex, the Hypogeum, where the very stones, chains, and etchings still bear witness to past occurrences. Upon the conclusion of the games, the stairwell descending into the Hippodrome was intentionally constructed to be precipitous and confined. Only a single path held any significance. Below, oil lamps along the walls cast feeble patches of illumination, scarcely piercing the gloom between them. The atmosphere was thick with the reek of animal excrement. The air was heavy with human perspiration and the scent of iron. From the depths of the darkness, a lion violently struck its enclosure, causing the metal to shriek. Above, the distant roar of the multitude resonated like muffled thunder through the stone. In this subterranean realm, the arena's clamor merely underscored that the city's focus lay elsewhere. No eyes observed the events unfolding within these passages. With a guard positioned behind him and an arena functionary guiding the path, the gladiator advanced. The official held a wax-covered tablet and a pointed stylus. Within these depths, that modest wooden block coated in wax wielded greater authority than any weapon. It bore names, figures, and symbols that converted sentient, living individuals into mere notations on a roster. A check mark next to one entry could signify dispatch to the mines. A different symbol might indicate being thrust onto the arena floor that very day. One such inscription denoted being handed over to the victor. This entire subterranean complex, the Hypogeum, represented a marvel of Roman engineering and simultaneously a testament to meticulous control and service. Passageways meandered among stations for animal handlers. Storage rooms contained stage props and mechanical devices. Holding enclosures confined creatures brought from Africa and the East. Antechambers housed prisoners awaiting execution, destined to be elevated on platforms to meet swift demise under the sun. And beyond these, there existed other chambers. These were the spaces that initially perplexed archaeologists. They were compact, seldom exceeding the dimensions of a contemporary sleeping quarter, measuring between 10 and 15 square meters. They were situated away from the primary thoroughfares, sequestered from the commotion around the animal enclosures and the hoists transporting stage elements to the arena level. When one scrutinizes the blueprints of various amphitheaters, such as Capua, Pompeii, Pozzuoli, and the Colosseum itself, an identical arrangement becomes evident, a grouping of rooms lacking any apparent practical function for the spectacles themselves. There were no inclines for beasts, no expansive areas for stowing gear, merely secluded compartments. Internally, their characteristics are disturbingly uniform. Slender stone seating, built to a precise elevation, proved too confined and unyielding to serve as places of repose. Iron rings were embedded into the walls, not just one or two, but multiple rings were situated at varying elevations, close to the ground, at waist level, and at shoulder height in certain chambers. These iron chains are not mere scattered fragments. They are firmly affixed within the very fabric of the construction, integral to its initial blueprint. The doors themselves are substantial, fortified with metal. These cells secure solely from the exterior. They are not the temporary holding pens preceding executions, nor are they workshops, nor are they intended for beasts. Distinct odor patterns and scratch marks are evident, precisely matching what historical records suggest. Enclosures designed to hold individuals captive in any posture a guard deemed fit. These women, confined within these cells, had already navigated Rome's administrative system for an extended period before ever reaching the arena. Following a conquest, imperial functionaries, known as commentarii, documented the captured individuals in ledgers, noting their numbers, origins, and physical state. Every woman had her own entry, potentially identified merely as Germanic, Britannic, Judean, or Parthian, or even further depersonalized to a mere number within a group. Her actual name could be distorted or completely disregarded. Her place of birth, age, and physical state held greater significance for the state than her personal identity. Officially, she was designated captiva, a war captive, which in reality signified her ownership by the Roman state. This allowed the state to lease, sell, or allocate her as it deemed appropriate. Some were dispatched to estates for labor, while others were sold in public marketplaces. However, a particular segment was designated for the grand urban spectacles, becoming an unacknowledged part of the game's personnel, though such terminology would not have been employed then. They were merely itemized as assets. Thus, when a gladiator captivated the audience and the game's patron wished to display munificence, the system for rewards was already established. The very administrators responsible for procuring exotic animals could similarly requisition additional captives. The identical accounting tablets that monitored the number of leopards available for the afternoon spectacle also recorded the quantity of women held in the subterranean cells. Following a combat, the gladiator did not invariably proceed straight back to the barracks. Occasionally, still clad in armor and marked with sweat and gore, he would be directed down an alternative passage. The official, carrying a tablet, led the way, scrutinizing written lines by the glow of a lamp. Behind him, the guard kept a hand close to his weapon, for despite any accolades this man might have received, he was still a skilled killer within an enclosed area. They arrived at a series of doors, behind each of which one or more captives awaited, as some ancient accounts imply, that a victorious combatant might be granted a selection. Perhaps doors were opened sequentially, faces momentarily glimpsed before being reclosed. Other indications suggest the decision was predetermined for him, much like an item being retrieved from a storeroom. Regardless, the choice had already been documented. The guard paused at a designated door, produced a key, and metal grated against metal. In certain instances, a woman was pulled forth, her chain fastened to a ring in the corridor. The gladiator was informed she was at his disposal for the duration of the night or the hour, or for whatever period the unspoken customs allowed. In other scenarios, he was propelled into the cell and the door secured behind him. The walls felt confining and the air was stagnant. The clamor from the arena overhead had completely subsided. Roman writers consistently omit any explicit account of the events that transpired next within these chambers. They do not elaborate on the specifics. They had no need to. For them, the circumstances demanded no elucidation. A male slave receiving a reward, and a captive woman categorized as chattel. In a society where enslaved individuals lacked legal safeguards against sexual exploitation, the advantages of triumph were self-evident. The architectural evidence speaks volumes where written records are silent. Rings at varying heights, benches positioned with brutal exactness, and marks etched into the stone surrounding the restraints. From the government's viewpoint, none of these actions constituted a crime. It wasn't even contentious. There was no legal classification for the rape of an enslaved person, as we define the concept today. Legal scholars debated property damage, depreciation, or the unauthorized utilization of another individual's belongings. However, when the government itself possessed the prisoners and distributed them as incentives, even that minimal safeguard vanished. The entire procedure was merely an additional component of the game's operational expenses. Reflect on the stark effectiveness of such a system. The ruling power subjugated a territory, seized its inhabitants, processed them, and subsequently employed some to spur on combatants to achieve superior results. This didn't necessitate additional funds or a new administrative department. It simply appended another item to the roster of perks, which ensured gladiators' compliance, sustenance, monetary rewards, the prospect of eventual liberty, and the prerogative to inflict their will upon individuals already dehumanized. A subsequent author, summarizing earlier narratives, condensed this rationale into one concise, harsh statement. The conqueror claims his reward just as the empire seizes its territories through subjugation without requiring consent. This was Rome's perspective. Authority was inherently self-validating. Victory signified righteousness, while defeat served as evidence that divine favor rested elsewhere. For an extended period, scholars primarily concentrated on the written records concerning the games, examining poets, ethicists, and legal documents. The subterranean rooms were acknowledged, yet their full significance wasn't consistently grasped. Nevertheless, as archaeological digs beneath amphitheaters progressed throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, these additional spaces repeatedly emerged, exhibiting comparable characteristics, too numerous to disregard and too distinct to be dismissed as mere arbitrary storage. In Rome, beneath the Colosseum, archaeologists charted an intricate network of passages and rooms. Tour guides continue to highlight the animal enclosures and the machinery that elevated stage props and combatants via trapdoors. However, within the comprehensive blueprints, one can also observe confined areas featuring the identical arrangement of benches and rings. These are situated peripherally, away from the primary thoroughfares, with some exhibiting considerable abrasion around the wall's fastening points, suggesting that chains had been repeatedly tugged and contorted there by human effort. In Capua, the city where Spartacus's rebellion originated, the discoveries are even more unsettling. Within the amphitheater's Hypogeum, archaeologists unearthed cell walls inscribed with markings, not precise, engraved texts akin to those found on victory arches. Instead, these were crude, irregular etchings created by hands lacking suitable implements and likely operating under severe time constraints. Some consist merely of lines and geometric forms, possibly representing someone tallying the days. Others constitute words, though not all the inscriptions are decipherable, with some being in fragmented Latin. While some are in Celtic or other indigenous tongues, certain messages are particularly striking. One roughly translates to, "I was Amelia from the Brigantes tribe. My children were slain before my eyes. Now I am naught," states another inscription, while a third implores, "To any deity listening, let me perish before dawn." These are not the pronouncements of high-ranking officials or military leaders. These writings are not found within Rome's renowned literary works. Their preservation wasn't due to their perceived importance, but rather because stone is incredibly difficult to obliterate. These inscriptions were carved by individuals who retained sufficient physical power to etch into stone, coupled with enough desperation to expend that energy on expressing words. Rather than seeking an escape, these messages reveal that the prisoners fully comprehended their perception within the system. They understood their demotion from roles like mother, daughter, or wife to a legal standing that didn't even recognize them as completely human. Their pleas are not directed at the emperor or the concept of justice, but rather to any deity whatsoever, any force beyond Rome's dominion that might be attentive. Roman chroniclers seldom refer to individuals such as Amelia. Their narratives focus on emperors, military expeditions, and political controversies. They either praise, condemn, or ridicule the public games, discussing whether the violence toughens citizens or weakens them. However, they do not dedicate any prose to the women held in subterranean cells. They have no need to, as, in their view, these women are merely background elements, akin to the arena sand or the animal enclosures. Cassius Dio, a historian from the 3rd century AD, provides just one piece of information. He notes that below significant arenas, facilities existed for individuals awaiting their use. This is an unusual expression. Their use, by whom, and for what purpose? Dio offers no further details. He apparently perceives no necessity to elaborate, as the phrase is sufficiently clear in his estimation. Yet, from our contemporary viewpoint, when considered alongside the tangible evidence, it appears to offer insight into a system that Roman high society accepted without question and never felt compelled to clarify. The most unsettling element is that no part of this arrangement seems provisional. These chambers were not quick alterations constructed for a single eccentric emperor's personal entertainment. They were incorporated into the stone architecture from the outset, or very early in the construction history of each edifice. This implies that architects and planners convened, sketching designs on wax tablets or scrolls, and sanctioned financial plans that encompassed not only enclosures for animals and armories for weapons, but also fixtures for restraint and confined seating within solitary cells. They deliberately ensured that these events could recur repeatedly and effectively. This represented a systematic recurrence, not an anomaly. It was a mechanism, not an impulsive act of violence. Once this is understood, the perception of the gladiator standing in the entrance and the woman seated on the bench completely transforms. He is not a rogue monster acting independently of the system, driven by some aberrant urge. Instead, he functions as an integral component within the system, performing precisely what Rome anticipated when it informed him he had merited a recompense. However, this brings forth a query that the Romans themselves rarely vocalized. What impact did this have on the men participating, on the combatants whose existences devolved into an endless loop of brutality? From those working both above and below the arena floor, to the guards who possessed the keys, and the officials whose duty was to record figures, while feigning ignorance that these figures represented human beings. In the subsequent section, we will explore the psychological toll of Victoria Carnalis, the various ways some Romans attempted to rationalize it, and the forces that ultimately led to the collapse of this entire sanguinary enterprise. And we will confront the most difficult question of all. How genuinely different are we from the populace, who strolled past those subterranean entrances and opted not to concern themselves with what lay behind them? Now visualize what transpires after that door closes and subsequently reopens. The gladiator retreats into the passageway. His armor hangs loosely, and his breathing is labored. A guard secures the cell door behind him, without so much as a glance inside. For the supervising officials, nothing of note has transpired. A box on a ledger has been checked, a special entitlement has been granted, and the mechanism has completed its operational cycle. The woman stays seated on the bench or the floor, staring blankly at the wall or into the void. She will never be immortalized in an epic poem, nor will her name ever be etched onto a monument. However, without individuals like her, Rome's entire system of conquest would not have operated. For the gladiator, this is simply an inherent part of the routine. His entire life is constructed from regulated bursts of aggression. Within the arena, he either kills or faces near death, while tens of thousands of spectators roar his name. Within the barracks, he trains, bleeds, and recuperates. In the cells beneath, he is informed that this constitutes his reward. He is, fundamentally, a slave, allowed to experience the sensation of a conqueror for a brief period. Rome leverages that feeling to deter him from directing his anger upwards toward the individuals who truly possess him. Some men likely accepted this without question, having been raised in a world where warfare, servitude, and sexual violence were commonplace instruments of power. Other individuals, particularly prisoners of war, compelled into gladiator schools, would have experienced the clash of roles more acutely. One day they were the vanquished, the next they were transformed into instruments of subjugation against others. No gladiator diaries survive that describe this internal conflict, but we know from other slave testimonies throughout history that being compelled to inflict harm upon others was a method masters used to keep captives fractured and disunited. A few Roman voices did indeed perceive that something was profoundly amiss. The philosopher Seneca, writing in the 1st century AD, recounts his attendance at the arena during the midday executions. He anticipates routine punishment. Instead, he witnesses what he terms pure murder. No skill, no genuine combat, just individuals being slaughtered in inventive ways. While the crowd laughs, he departs in disgust. He writes that witnessing such cruelty debases people, teaching them to derive pleasure from pain and to forget the humanity of victims. Seneca does not directly address Victoria Carnalis, scarcely anyone does, but his grievance targets the fundamental issue. The games were not neutral entertainment. They served as instruction, conditioning citizens to view certain lives as valueless, training them to observe a person in agony and to feel excitement rather than horror. After a population has been conditioned in such a manner, incorporating sexual violence into the system does not represent a significant jump. Other authors criticize these spectacles from various perspectives. The satirist Juvenal ridicules aristocratic women who were infatuated with gladiators, recounting how a high-born lady deserted her spouse to elope with a combatant. Attracted by his scars and renown, Juvenal lampoons her, yet through this he exposes the profound extent to which the gladiator's allure had permeated esteemed social circles. These individuals, formerly positioned at the lowest rung of the legal hierarchy, had transformed into coveted figures for those at the apex of society. This dichotomy instilled both excitement and apprehension in Rome. Early Christian authors took an even stronger stance. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Tertullian instructed adherents to completely shun the arena. He proclaimed the shows to be steeped in gore and malevolent spirits, asserting that observing them defiled one's spirit. Subsequent figures, such as Augustine, recalled the highly addictive nature of these contests. Augustine recounts an anecdote concerning an acquaintance who initially had no desire to visit the arena. Despite being unwillingly brought there by his friends, he attempted to keep his eyes shut, but upon hearing a collective roar from the spectators, he glanced up and was immediately captivated. The brutality drew him in, transforming him into an individual who yearned for additional spectacles. These authors do not elaborate on Victoria Carnalis. There is no necessity for them to do so. Instead, they denounce the whole framework that facilitated such occurrences. They characterize the games as an environment where carnal desire and bloodshed converged. It was a venue where both the privileged and the general populace assembled to witness individuals being stripped, revealed, shamed, and annihilated. Furthermore, the inclusion of state-regulated sexual access to the subterranean level of that edifice does not disrupt the underlying rationale. Rather, it perfects it. What impact did this arrangement have on the guards entrusted with the keys, or on the clerks responsible for managing the rosters, and on the throngs traversing those subterranean chambers, never once pondering what existed directly below their footsteps? The majority of Romans never perceived themselves as merciless. They would likely have asserted that they were upholding customs, partaking in public amusement, and performing their duties. The true terror resides within that very normalcy. As the system grew more commonplace, individuals increasingly disclaimed accountability for it. For hundreds of years, this apparatus of subjugation, display, and physical triumph functioned with minimal, significant disruptions. Emperors ascended and descended from power. Some exhibited personal cruelty, while others demonstrated greater moderation. A select few, such as Marcus Aurelius, portrayed themselves as ethical thinkers. Nevertheless, under almost every one of these rulers, the games persisted, and the Colosseum, along with other amphitheaters, remained consistently occupied. Prisoners continued to be handled, gladiators continued their combat, and below the stone gates incessantly opened and shut. Therefore, how did this come to an end? It wasn't through a solitary piece of legislation. It did not conclude in a single, decisive instant. The demise of this enterprise unfolded gradually, originating from several simultaneous fronts. Primarily, financial considerations played a role. Gladiatorial contests incurred immense costs. One needed to acquire or apprehend animals, provide them sustenance, train them, construct and upkeep intricate equipment, compensate trainers, and accommodate combatants. Additionally, a vast workforce had to be employed. During the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire was afflicted by recurrent crises, including civil conflicts and incursions. Amidst epidemics, economic turmoil, and a rapid succession of emperors, it was often quipped that the military, not the monarchy, held true authority within that era. Even affluent individuals became reluctant to fund grand spectacles, leading to a reduction in their scope. Secondly, a cultural transformation occurred with the expansion of Christianity. Especially within urban centers, an increasing number of individuals started to perceive the arena as morally objectionable. However, this sentiment wasn't universal. Numerous citizens and leaders retained their affection for the games. Nevertheless, the notion of human life holding sacred worth began to challenge the long-held conviction that vanquished individuals were mere instruments. This presented Christian emperors with a dilemma. They aimed to portray themselves as champions of a religion advocating compassion, yet concurrently utilized the games to demonstrate authority and appease the populace. Some sought a middle ground. Emperor Constantine, in the early 4th century, enacted legislation restricting the deployment of specific offenders in the arena. He urged officials to dispatch them to the mines instead. Subsequent rulers reiterated prohibitions on gladiatorial training academies, but these bans were sporadically enforced, as local authorities and residents frequently opposed them. They were unwilling to relinquish their public shows. By the dawn of the 5th century, nevertheless, the opposition had grown stronger. A well-known tale, part historical fact and part myth, recounts a monk named Telemachus. Subsequent narratives claim he journeyed to Rome, observed a gladiatorial contest, then jumped into the arena and implored the spectators to cease. They killed him by stoning. When news reached Emperor Honorius, the narrative suggests he was so appalled that he ultimately outlawed gladiatorial fighting for good. This occurred in 404 AD. Contemporary historians dispute the specifics. Did events unfold precisely as described? Was Telemachus solely responsible for altering imperial policy? Likely not, yet we are aware that by the early 5th century, formal legislation had largely brought an end to gladiatorial contests in the Western Roman Empire. The venues did not cease operations immediately. However, the core practice of skilled combatants slaying one another for public amusement gradually diminished. It is vital to grasp what persisted despite those prohibitions. Slavery persisted, as did the sexual abuse of prisoners. Armies still employed sexual violence as a tool of intimidation, and affluent men continued to regard the bodies of the vulnerable as mere commodities. What ceased was a particular amalgamation, state-sponsored violent spectacles in vast amphitheaters linked to a structured network of clandestine sexual favors. The entire apparatus was gradually disassembled, but the underlying mindsets that created it took much longer to disappear. In numerous regions, they never truly vanished. Currently, visitors traverse the remnants of the Colosseum. They capture images where emperors once resided and gaze into the uncovered Hypogeum, a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers. Tour guides indicate the lifts, the concealed openings, and the animal enclosures. Some refer to the holding cells, but only a handful delve into the specifics of Victoria Carnalis. This phrase appears scholarly, almost clinical. It obscures more than it clarifies. The truth was straightforward. Conquest transformed individuals into mere stock. The arena then allocated that human stock to maintain the operational flow of the system. Imagine standing there today, on the higher tiers where ancient Romans once applauded. If you gazed into the remains of the Hippodrome, a shiver might run down your spine. This isn't due to ghosts. The location isn't haunted. The stones are merely stones. the terror doesn't reside within them. Instead, it originated from the decisions of individuals who observed an immense apparatus of torment and labeled it as amusement, national pride, or heavenly righteousness. Consider the woman introduced in the initial sequence. No monument commemorates her. Eventually, her physical form succumbed, perhaps to illness, injury, or sheer fatigue. A scribe erased an entry from a wax tablet, then inscribed a new figure in an alternative column. Her place in the confinement was subsequently occupied by another individual, a casualty of a different conflict. Following yet another razed village, the system's operation wasn't reliant on any one casualty. Its power lay in its capacity for infinite replacement. Reflect on the gladiator. Perhaps he perished in the arena mere months afterward, impaled by an adversary's weapon as the spectators clamored for his demise. Alternatively, he might have attained liberty following numerous triumphs. He could have walked past the amphitheater in his old age, recalling a life constructed upon the anguish of others. The government exploited him as both a tool of combat and a promotional symbol. The state compensated him with the very brutality once inflicted upon him, then cast him aside once his utility waned. When we speak of Rome nowadays, our attention typically gravitates toward its tangible accomplishments, such as roads, aqueducts, military tactics, legal frameworks, and grand architectural feats. All these are undeniable. Yet beneath these achievements, systems akin to Victoria Carnalis operated. These were systems that transformed sexual aggression into a routine practice, integrated into governmental finances, and rationalized by notions of ethnicity, conquest, and social hierarchy. Should we disregard this, we construct a romanticized portrayal of Rome, resembling a film advertisement rather than its true reality. This narrative extends beyond Rome. It concerns the actions of powerful nations once they internalize their own propaganda, convinced of their inherent right to govern, that their adversaries are subhuman, and that triumph bestows upon them the prerogative to seize anything they desire. Whenever an administration diminishes individuals to mere statistics, on a ledger, whenever throngs applaud as genuine agony transforms into public entertainment, whenever aggression toward the vulnerable is regarded as an advantage for those in power, the rationale of the amphitheater resurfaces. The Colosseum endures because its construction was meant for longevity. However, those who endured torment within its walls left no such enduring evidence. We must seek their presence amidst fragmented carvings, in casual observations by appalled authors, and in etchings on stone. When we uncover them, they pose a silent query that Rome never addressed. Had you been among the spectators, would you have departed once the executions commenced? Would you have declined entry? Or would you have remained, consumed your refreshments, and deemed it ordinary? If you have followed this account thus far, my gratitude. The majority favor a simplified historical narrative, featuring unambiguous protagonists and antagonists, and neat conclusions. You, however, opted to examine the section beneath the arena, where the historical account is grim and fragmented. Should you desire further concealed historical accounts such as these, tales that reveal the true actions of empires, please subscribe, click the like button, and activate notifications. To ensure you don't overlook the subsequent in-depth exploration, please forward this video to anyone who continues to think Rome was solely about marble grandeur and prestige. It's essential for them to observe what transpired in the shadows once the public had departed.